Welcome to today's lesson. This is lecture 1 and we would be looking at the characteristics of solid waste. So the first thing we want to look at is the definition of solid waste. So when we talk about solid waste, remember there are all types of waste, and waste will result from any and every kind of activity that both human and animals would carry out just for basic survival. And of course, the types of waste that we produce will involve all types, but we are specifically talking about solid waste, and the result or the product resulting from our activities that we need to survive would be characterized as waste because it is now useless or unwanted. Now remember, when we talk about activities, human and animal, some of the most basic activities that we need to carry out for basic survival would be consumption of food. Human beings and animals also need shelter, human beings need clothing, etc. So these are some of the basics we need for survival. And even with that, at its minimum, we still produce waste. So just imagine when we get involved in other activities now beyond what is required for basic survival, we now magnify the quantity of waste being produced. So as mentioned before, we have all types of waste. Solid waste is what we specifically will be focusing on in this course, and even within the category of solid waste we have different classifications. If you follow with me on the chart, you will see that we have non-hazardous waste and hazardous waste. Now under non-hazardous waste we have municipal waste, which we would look at in some detail. We have industrial waste and agricultural waste. Then under hazardous waste, we have hazardous waste that can be produced from household activities as well as industrial activities. Now you would notice that you have industrial waste that come under both categories of non-hazardous as well as hazardous. I've defined for you some of the types of industrial waste. We have waste resulting from construction and demolition. For example, we know anytime we have work to do at home, for example, maybe you're putting on new windows or new doors, you will have door frames and windows, you may have concrete waste, etc. There is also listed waste, universal waste, which would include things like batteries, light bulbs, etc. Characteristic waste. And then there is waste resulting from the treatment of other types of waste, such as what you would find from waste treatment plants, like what WASA, for example, would be responsible for handling. Okay? Right, so let's look specifically at some of these types of waste. As I mentioned before, we are going to be looking at municipal waste. What do we mean by municipal waste? Anytime you hear that word municipal, I want you to think of urban environments. So you're talking about towns and cities. So this would be all the types of waste that would be produced within those types of environments. Then our industrial waste would be all waste produced as a result of industrial activity, processing, manufacturing, etc. Hazardous waste, again another category of waste, and remember in the previous slide we saw that hazardous waste can be produced within industrial settings, and it also can be produced in municipal settings as well. So this is all types of waste that is dangerous or potentially harmful to both our health and the environment. So not only, when I say environment, I'm not only talking about plants, but I'm talking about animals as well. So let's look at various classifications of municipal waste. Remember, this is a type of waste that would be produced in urban areas. For example, we have an abundance of food waste. Food waste that will come from our consumption of meat, fruit, vegetables, all the packaging involved in that when we purchase food from the groceries, the market, the fruit peel, the vegetable peels, all of these things would be considered food waste, right? And of course, as we talk about food waste, I'd want you to consider what are some of the management issues you would have to consider when you have this type of waste in your house. How do you handle that type of waste? Do you have a compost in your backyard, or do you just throw it out with the rest of your garbage for it to go to the landfill? It's also important for us to recognize that this type of waste is what we would call organic waste. This is waste that would decompose very rapidly, especially in climates like ours, warm wet climates. Then we have another category of municipal waste called rubbish. This would be combustible as well as non-combustible solid waste. Those combustible meaning can be easily burnt up. So this would not include food waste, because those types of waste contain a fair amount of moisture. It also does not consist of waste that can decompose rapidly as well, right? So that's rubbish. So as the picture shows, this is where you would find things like cardboard boxes, plastics, etc. This would include a lot of the packaging that many of the things we purchase at home would come in. Then we also have ashes and residues. This would include materials remaining from the burning of wood, coal, coke, and other combustible waste. So these are examples of combustible material. And now for us in Trinidad and Tobago and many parts of the West, you would not necessarily find a whole lot of this type of waste. There are some parts of the world that actually still depend on these types of materials to produce their fuel for cooking and for heat, etc. So this is also another type of waste. Then we have demolition and construction waste. So this, as I mentioned before, this would be waste from construction activities, from buildings and other structures, remodeling your homes, remodeling commercial and industrial buildings, etc. So there we have on the slide a picture of some of the types of pieces of concrete, steel, etc. Now, what do we do with this type of waste? Have you ever really thought about it? What really happens to this type of waste? Then we have special waste, street sweepings, road litter, dead animals. Here in Trinidad, we often have a problem with that. Have we considered when the roadways are being cleaned, who handles that? What happens to these types of waste? Treatment plant waste, as I mentioned, we have treatment plants. For example, WASA would have solid waste treatment plants where waste would be conveyed and transported to these treatment plants for it to be treated before the waste is released into the environment, where it can be safely released into the environment. So this type of waste can come from both municipal settings as well as industrial settings. So as mentioned before, some general sources of municipal waste can be residential. We looked at some of them already. Can come from our kitchens, it can come from our toilets, etc. It can come from commercial settings. If you consider business places, what types of waste will come from business places, it would be very similar to that comes from the home. And additionally, you would find large amounts of rubbish waste coming from these places as well. Open areas, as we mentioned, streets, parks, alleys, you would find a lot of not only street sweepings, let's say from parks, you would find a lot of grass, tree cuttings, etc. And then from treatment plant sites, you will have water, wastewater. Then you would also have chemical waste that comes down in the water, and industrial treatment processes would be necessary in order to treat that waste before it is safely released back into the environment. Let's look briefly at industrial waste. So the waste arising from industrial activities, and typically these would include things like rubbish, ashes, demolition and construction waste, special waste, and hazardous waste. So these are some of the types of or categories of waste we can see coming from industrial activities. And of course, you have all types and all categories of industrial activities taking place in Trinidad, from food manufacturing, furniture manufacturing, to highly industrialized type of activities such as the petrochemical industries, which would produce a lot of hazardous waste, highly toxic waste. And when this type of hazardous waste is produced, we have to be very careful to manage these types of waste properly, because of how harmful they can be to both human health and the environment. So waste that pose a substantial danger immediately or over a period of time to human and plant and animal life, this is what we call hazardous waste. We can categorize a hazardous waste into several categories, such as radioactive substances that can come from the technological industry, development of different types of technologies and devices. You have waste, radioactive waste that can come from research labs, etc., from medicine, because we have a lot of specialized technology used in medicine as well. Chemicals, of course, would be considered hazardous waste. And then we have biological waste. These would be potentially infectious or dangerous waste, such as you might get from hospitals, for example, such as used syringes, or waste that might come from surgeries, etc. We have flammable waste. So these would be waste that create fires under certain conditions, such as chemicals such as ethanol, methanol, etc., as listed there. Then we also have explosive substances. So these would be substances that are considered unstable even under normal conditions. So these would have to be stored in highly controlled environments. So the hazardous wastes are generated in limited amounts throughout most industrial activities. Quantities of hazardous waste developed at each source is a major concern. So the source, of course, that would be the point at which the waste is being generated. So we have to be very careful about how the waste is being managed at the source of generation. And the other area we have to look at is the spread. So the spreading of the hazardous waste is another concern. This can be done by spillage, and this will happen especially where you have absorbent materials that can easily absorb the spills. And you have to be concerned about how this hazardous waste can percolate into soils as well. That would be a pathway there that will cause it to travel. So essentially, when we're talking about hazardous waste, we have three main issues to be concerned about when we want to manage the control of that waste. We need to manage at 3 points: the source, where the waste is being generated; the pathway, you have to look at all the possible paths along which the waste can travel, whether it's through soils, whether it's through the air, if it's in a building, whether it's down the corridors or stairways, etc. And the receptor, finally the receptor. Where would it end? Who would receive it? what populations would be affected by it. The receptor, the protection needs to be administered there as well. So let's look briefly at properties of solid waste. We're going to look very briefly at the physical composition, chemical and biological composition, as well as how waste can change over time. So the physical composition of waste consists of, one, we can look at individual components of waste, as we mentioned before. For example, if you go through your household waste, you can classify your household waste into different components, such as food waste, paper, cardboard, plastics, and of course glass, etc. Then you can also classify waste according to the size of the particles. So particle size is of importance in terms of the recovery of materials. The finer the size is actually a little more difficult. Coarser and larger size particles of waste would tend to be a little easier to recover, and this can be done through mechanized means such as the use of screens, magnetic separators, of course all depending on the nature of the material. Moisture content is also another characteristic you would want to look at. Moisture content would usually be expressed in terms of per unit area mass of whether the material is wet or dry. And what do we mean by that? An example, percentage of the wet or dry mass of the material for every 1 kilogram. So for every 1 kilogram of waste, what percentage would be considered moisture? Another characteristic or component of physical waste would be density. So the solid waste densities vary with geographic location, season, and length of time in storage. So for example, what do we mean by that? In a place like Trinidad and Tobago, where we have 2 seasons, we have rainy season that will produce more garden waste because we have our vegetation would be in abundance at that point in time. So density would be heavier in the rainy season than the dry season. Then we have the chemical and biological composition of waste. Again, this would be another category that would be important for us to know in terms of making determination as to what are the appropriate techniques to use for processing and recovery of waste. So processing and recovery of waste is an important step in the solid waste management process. So if the waste can be used for fuel, that's the energy recovery part, the following are the important things that you need to look at. The first characteristic would be what we call proximate analysis. And what do we mean by that? Proximate analysis, this is a technique that separates and identifies categories of waste in a mixture. So you have a mixture of waste. What would these categories look like? Moisture, for example. How is the moisture lost at 105 degrees Celsius? Another category would be volatile matter. How much volatile matter do you have in your waste? The mix of waste. Ash. How much ash do you have after burning? And after the burning of the waste, how much fixed carbon do you have? Another characteristic you would want to look for would be the fusing point, that is the melting point of ash. Ultimate analysis, that's the next one. This would be a determination of the percentage of the various types of chemical substances you have in your waste, such as listed there, percentage of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, etc. And then you would also want to know the heating value, that's the energy value of your waste. Alright, the energy value would be expressed in kilojoules per gram. And here on this slide we have a simple formula that can be used to determine the energy value of your waste. Um, Now if you just follow here with me, you can clearly see that I've defined some aspects of the formula there for you. So it's fairly simple. So you have 337 carbon plus 1428 by your hydrogen minus oxygen plus 9 sulfur, and it's all divided by 8. Okay, so I'm not expecting you to necessarily memorize this formula. I just want you to have a general understanding, and I wanted you to be introduced to how it can be calculated. Okay, then we have changes in composition. So we're talking about the changes in the composition of the waste itself. So we looked at many different aspects of waste, characteristics, etc., categories, and what we're saying is this can actually change over time. So in order to plan effectively for solid waste management, information and data about the waste, such as we had been looking at before, so we need data to be able to identify all those characteristics, composition, etc. about the waste, so that we can, in understanding the nature of the waste, we can plan for it. We can better plan to manage the waste that we produce, because the last thing we need is a continuous buildup of all categories of waste, including hazardous waste, that can lead to a compounding of the waste problem that we already have. So technical changes in areas such as food processing and packaging, changes in world economy, these all have an effect, or they all affect the composition of solid waste. For example, when we look at the technology industry, every couple months we seem to be having new models of cell phones and smartphones, and people just seem to be changing their technology so quickly. What do we do with the waste when we change a phone? What actually happens? So we have a buildup of technological waste. Food packaging. More and more of our food today comes in packages from the grocery store. When you consider that and you look back to your parents' and grandparents' days, there wasn't as much waste. Much of the food they ate, they would purchase at the market, so it would be more food waste. So we have an abundance of waste just being produced just from our normal daily lives. And then when you look at economies, typically what you would tend to find is the more affluent a household or the more affluent a nation is, you find that the amount of waste produced would tend to be more. So these are things that you need to understand, because these changes can actually affect the amount and type of waste that we produce, and we need to be aware of this in order to plan for and manage the waste over long periods of time. For example, do we need to put recycling plants in place? What type of collection systems do we need to put in place in order to facilitate the collection of the waste for processing? Do we need more landfill space? All of these things we need information and data for. And lastly, I just want to highlight, since we were talking about the need for information and data, all of that is needed for the purpose of waste management. So, point one, the Industrial Revolution. I don't know how many of you might be familiar with this point in history. This occurred around the 1700s to early 1800s. This was actually the beginning of our modern problem of uncontrolled industrial waste. This is when there was a proliferation of industrial activity, and as this began to increase, so did our problem with waste, all types of waste, as well as pollution. So this waste is often disposed of in landfills if no regulation or no management policies are in place and being implemented and strictly monitored. And this is with regards to the treatment of the type of waste. Okay, so a lot of our waste here in Trinidad tends to go to the landfills. Now, EMA, the Environmental Management Authority, has a number of policies in place that they use to govern, and a number of rules and laws that they have that they use to govern their activities in terms of helping to manage what is taking place in the environment. For example, there's the water pollution rules, noise pollution rules. They would also use the guidelines from the hazardous waste guidelines from the Basel Convention. Additionally, in Trinidad, we also have the Integrated Solid Waste and Resource Management Policy, as well as the fairly new National Waste Recycling Policy. These are all in place to help guide the solid waste management problem that we have in Trinidad and Tobago. And in recent times, you all should have been hearing on the news that the government is trying to implement, in fact they already have begun putting things in place for the implementation of a national recycling policy. So at this point, I want to thank you for joining me for today's lesson, and you are asked to kindly proceed to e-classroom for today's activities.